Okay, Cindy, are you going to start it?
Yes, of course. Yeah, just a second. Right. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Cindy Peister, and I head up UUJEC's Peace, Equity, and Climate Task Force. For those of you unfamiliar with our work, we address economic injustice in all its forms. And this includes addressing the unsustainable Department of Defense budget. It is over half of the US discretionary budget annually, depriving us of the resources we need for human and climate needs. But militarism and wars also come at the cost of emissions, which are devastating our nation and our planet. Yet these emissions are ignored, often as even as the Earth's surface temperatures reach the 1.5 degrees Celsius benchmark that signals the approach of critical tipping points. This must change. We UUs have much to be proud of. Many of you here today are working on behalf of mutual aid, housing, democracy, human rights, and due process for all, and of ending the genocide in Gaza. But all of our efforts are connected. We must recognize that militarism serves as the brutal enforcer of capitalism abroad and now possibly at home as well. It also contributes to to the unlivable conditions that force immigration. UUs have done well in taking on climate, but we can do better. I'm hoping I want that all of you who took your time to attend here today and listen to what Professor Crawford have to say will be able to take this back to your congregations. And we invite you to remember that UUJEC and PEC can be used as resources. This
We need to use time, but not only to
webinar and others like it will be online for use by our congregations. Dr. Neta Crawford is Montague Burton Professor at the University of Oxnard.
You're not going to be here, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
We need to
I will
mute somebody
be-
here.
Yes, I'll be in Brooklyn.
Can
Okay.
So
everybody
this
be
is,
muted?
I take it this is an
Somebody's
in-person
talking
meeting.
about Brooklyn, please
It's
mute.
an in-person meeting, and because Melanie is in town, and we will meet with her and John Moore, her deputy director. So.
Can everyone be muted, please?
Okay, go ahead, Cindy.
Were you able to hear my introduction or not?
Yes.
Okay, so we're really honored to have Dr. Crawford with us today, and she is so distinguished as the Montague Burton Professor at the University of Oxnard and co-founder and strategic advisor of Brown University's Cost of War Project. I cannot adequately underscore just how foundational her research has been and continues to be, both domestically and globally, for our movements addressing the role of militarism and war on climate.
Yeah, I'm listening to a webinar.
Oh, yeah, right.
Professor Crawford will speak to us for approximately 40 minutes, and then we will follow with Q&A. Sally will be watching our co-leader of UUJEC, and she will be gleaning the questions and bringing them up at the proper time. So please put your questions there. I will now turn the floor over to Gary Anderson, a longtime UU who is a member of the Peace, Equity, and Climate Task Force, and he will introduce both Neta Crawford and her amazing book. Thank you, Gary. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Cindy. Have we gotten everybody switched off except for Dr. Crawford and Cindy and me? Thank you.
Can we have Dr. Crawford on the big, large screen, Terry, for the recording?
Okay, so thank you, Cindy. I'm Gary Anderson, a member of First Universalist Church of Denver, Colorado. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Neta Crawford. It's clear to me that endless war, societal justice, and the health of the planet are not separate issues. However, many people see only one aspect of this mix and engage what might be called carbon tunnel thinking. For instance, this can lead to people carefully consider the carbon footprint of their transportation and consumer choices, but then going blank when asked to consider the carbon footprint of a 2,000-pound bomb, or 100,000 of them. Dr. Crawford is that rare interdisciplinary expert who has spent decades working across artificial partitions of expertise to show broader pictures. Her 2019 paper, Pentagon Fuel Use, Climate Change, and the Cost of War, was a real eye-opener for me. So I was delighted to find that her investigations have continued, resulting in her most recent book, The Pentagon, Climate Change, and War, MIT Press of 2022. I highly recommend that you order and read this book. In preparation for today's webinar, I set out to quickly turn those pages in that book to get a sense of what it was about. That approach did not work at all. It's so readable and engaging, I was captured on the first page. The book leads us through humanity's search for higher yield sources of energy. Human muscle is replaced by animal muscle, then water, coal, and oil energy. And most importantly, it explains the success of societal readjustments that have built the systems that now serve and constrain us. Dr. Crawford, welcome.
Well, it's my pleasure to be with you. And if you'd like, I'll just give you a little flavor of why I did this book and why I wrote the paper for the Cost of War project that preceded the book. And then I'll talk more specifically about the key challenges that we're facing and the role of the military and climate. So I was for years teaching a course at Boston University to undergraduates on climate change. And when we began teaching this course, people were still in climate change denial. There are very few of those people now. But there were some gaps in my knowledge. And one, in this overview course, I wanted to have a slide in one lecture that would explain what militaries were, and I couldn't find a piece of data for the slide. And then that started me on sort of down the rabbit hole I went to try to understand military emissions in the context that they are, the larger context. But all of my work is really about several key challenges. One, for most of my adult life, that is the last 45 years, I've been working on war and military spending and arms races. And then the more recent interest in the connections between war and the environment. All of that, however, is linked to democracy, another concern that many of us have, and it's now in jeopardy in the United States, has been, and I'll say a little bit why I think that's long in coming. And then I've also been concerned with inequality. These are the key challenges of our time, and they're not separate, they're linked, as you know. So war actually makes democracy more difficult. Now, why is that? First of all, there's the concentration of power in an executive. And we see, for instance, President Bush in 2003 and actually starting in 2001, decided to promote a theory of the unitary executive, which is what Donald Trump is using to say that basically in times of stress, in fact, almost all the time, the president has the power and should, and the other branches of government are not co-equal. But so war has often been the trigger for concentrating power in the executive. War also increases inequality because the military spending actually tends to benefit the certain industries, and then therefore certain individuals who run those industries, the military-industrial complex. It in addition exacerbates inequality and inhumanity, not just because of the ways that money is spent, but because money is not spent on human needs, as you know. The need to have a large military, the felt need to have a large military, comes from fear of the other, and not having a sense of what the alternatives are in a world that is conflictual. So my work has been about trying to expose and deepen our understanding of these links, which are often more obvious to people outside of the academy than inside, and to try to help us understand, more recently in particular, how the need for the access to fuel for the US military and other militaries has shaped the world that we live in. And this began in the 19th century when we made the transition to using coal and then petroleum to both power the industries that make the weapons, but also for transportation in warfare. So to increase the speed and the distance and the duration of the use of military forces, we moved to these high energy sources of power. First coal, as I say, for ships mostly, and also for railways and industry. But then after World War I, increasingly petroleum. But the desire to have that access to that has meant that the United States and other countries have made arrangements with, in some cases, authoritarian governments who have, for instance, in the Middle East, lots of the thing that we want. So the foreign policy is sort of circular in the sense that in order to have the thing that increases your military might, that is the fuel, you want to protect the source of that. So you have more bases, which require more fuel. You have relationships with sometimes authoritarian governments or in unstable places, which are made more unstable by, in some cases, your presence. And this cycle needs to be broken. And there are many ways to intervene on this cycle, but one way to do it is to decrease the demand for the oil that we believe is essential for our non-military and our military life. So I want to focus on now on the ways that fuel is both central to the U.S. military and the consequences for the environment. Okay, so every aircraft, every ship that is not powered by nuclear fission, and all our U.S. submarines are now powered by nuclear power plants. But most of the surface ships and the aircraft and the tanks and the armored vehicles and so on are powered by petroleum. And that has made the United States military the single largest fuel user in the United States and the single largest emitter, not just of the US government, of greenhouse gases like carbon, methane, nitrous oxide, but also of the United States itself. So it is a huge institutional emitter of greenhouse gases. So when you think about it, what this means is that this huge need, as I said, has driven some of the foreign policy relationships that the United States has, but it also tends to drive more need as these areas become less stable. So what has happened as a result is the United States military, in seeking to protect its access to this fuel and the perceived need to have this equipment that uses the fuel and creates these emissions, did not want to, when it came time in the 1990s to negotiate limits on greenhouse gas emissions, to have their fuel use understood and their emissions understood. So at the in the Clinton administration, at the point when there was a discussion over what should be in the Kyoto Protocol, that is the treaty that talks about sources of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions like carbon, and how we're going to count those emissions and how they should be reduced. This whole system was, in a sense, discussed in the White House. And, of course, Al Gore was central to this. They decided, based on a memo from the Department of Defense, that they would not want to count and therefore include in international reporting military emissions. But they didn't say, let's just not count US military emissions, which were the largest in the world. But they said we shouldn't have it reported at all. So even to this day, when countries give their reports of their emissions, they do not include military emissions. Now, only recently, at the behest of Congress, has the Pentagon produced, I bet this won't happen anymore under the current administration, but has the Pentagon produced a sufficient accounting of their own emissions? But we still don't understand military industrial emissions. And to understand the scale of that, one has to look at the large companies like Lockheed Martin or Boeing or Northrop Grumman. And these individual companies, if you add them up, are at least as large in terms of their military industrial emissions as the military. And I think if altogether, this is a large portion of the United States emissions. Now, of course, the United States is no longer the largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world, but we are certainly per capita still the largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world. China has exceeded our emissions, or is on track to do so. So what I've described so far is a world that we made in order to control, particular regions of the world. We made a large military. The largest in the world was 700 now, but at the peak, 2,000 overseas bases, each of which uses and needs fuel and equipment. And we have this sort of global empire of bases, and we have a global fuel distribution network, which is enabling this, both making war, but also training with other countries and facilitating basically the flexing of U.S. muscles, so that we don't have to actually use the power, but it's the presence of the United States. So what I'm suggesting then is that even though it's only recently we've begun to pay attention to military emissions, and in particular the emissions of active duty military and military industry, we have only also recently begun to understand the emissions from war itself. And so there's more recent research being done, and you can find it in some climate change journals, on how it is that war itself causes greenhouse gas emissions. And it's in several ways. The first way is simply the burning of stuff. Okay, the burning of cities, the burning of buildings, in some cases, the deliberate targeting of, as the US did against ISIS, of fuel depots and oil wells and so on. In the 1993, the Gulf War, the Iraqis set their own oil fields alight, and those burned for weeks and months. So sometimes it's just simply the burning. Sometimes the emissions are changed because the places where carbon is stored have been destroyed. For example, during the Civil War and during many wars, and in fact, Russia has done this in Ukraine, forests have been set alight. Okay, so when you take away the forest, you're taking away the ability of carbon to be stored in those forests. You're destroying carbon sequestration possibilities. When the oceans are harmed and large mammals are killed, you're affecting carbon sequestration. So that is, you're taking away the capacity to absorb the carbon that we're emitting. Okay, another way that war affects emissions is of course after wars, during and after wars, people rebuild. And it turns out that the rebuilding process can be more or less carbon intensive. So if you go back to a country and you don't rebuild with sort of green energy, you might put in another coal-fired plant or oil-fired plant. You might use cement, which is not green, and so on. So rebuilding is also a source of emission. So we destroy something, we rebuild, we take away the ability to sequester carbon. So there's really three sort of ways that war is affecting the environment, as I've said. So the military's emissions, military industrial emissions, and war itself, as well as the rebuilding. Okay, so I've got three threads. War has driven our search for fuel. The search for fuel has driven conflict, and then conflict and war affected emissions. Okay, and then the next thread I want to get at is the way that the United States military has begun to think about this since, say, the early 1990s is that climate change will cause conflict. Okay, and so they're concerned. At first they were concerned, they didn't want emissions counted because they were worried that they would have to reduce their activities if they were told to cut their fuel use. So that's why they resisted reporting. But then they were concerned in the early 1990s and later that climate change could cause increased conflict. And so what they thought and have posited, and many people have said, is that climate change will lead directly to war because people will fight over scarce resources, or there'll be migration that will bring people into conflict, or there'll be overpopulation, and basically the chaos caused by natural disasters will lead to the breakdown of governments and so on. So it's a very dystopic vision of what's coming. And in particular, the argument has been that, you know, as sea levels rise, as temperatures increase, as people find it increasingly difficult to get access to safe drinking water because of salination or because they're displaced, they will come. And they'll come to the US or Europe, and they will take your stuff. They'll take your resources. They'll take your water. So the idea that climate change will cause conflict to come to you is part of this more recent narrative coming out of, for example, the Department of Homeland Security. Now, this doesn't have to be the case. It doesn't have to be the case that climate change causes conflict. We could make that world if, you know, through our policies, or we could make a world where reducing the scale of emissions and thereby decreasing the rise in temperature. We could make a world where we treat climate change migrants with respect and care, where we reduce the need for them to move by helping them in place. You know, when we live in this world where we treat others humanely, I think it's less likely that we're going to see the world that where climate change conflict is going to come to the neighborhood near you. So those are the main themes I wanted to address. I also just wanted to give sort of a few other, make a few other points, sort of that may or may not come up in questions. But one other thing the military has talked about is how they're leading in terms of innovation, that they're extremely good at creating systems and equipment, and they're producing spin-offs that will help us in terms of the green revolution. They're not saying that now because Trump doesn't believe that we should be talking about climate change, but for a certain period during the Obama and Biden administrations, there was a sort of narrative coming out of the Department of Defense that, okay, we've got microgrids down, we know how to build efficient solar panels, we can invest in good batteries. Now, yes, they can do all of those things, but it's actually much more efficient to do those things in the private sector, in the public sector. And we shouldn't be investing in the military to do something that we're better off investing in the private sector to do. So I just wanted to address that. There's some of this notion during the Biden administration that we're getting a lean, green fighting machine, and it's actually not so green. It's certainly not lean. It is still the fighting machine that we've known, and it is reducing its emissions, but it should not be our solution. It cannot be our solution to climate change. So those are the main things I wanted to talk about, and I'm very interested in answering any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Nita. I see you really covered the basics there. Gary, I know you had some questions. Would you like to ask them? And then Sally, will go to you and you can see what comes up in the chat. Any of you that have questions, please put them in the chat. Gary, did you have questions you wanted to ask?
It seems to me that climate activists do a lot of good work locally, and they pay attention to idling their cars when they pick up their kids at school and such. But there's been a historical bias against really critically examining the U.S. military. Do you have any suggestions on how we might best approach that to get climate activists to really open up the conversation about not only the $1 trillion that we spend on the U.S. military annually, but the lack of transparency and accountability for military emissions?
Mm-hmm. There has been a focus, and I think that it was deliberate, on individual activity. So, you driving your SUV, or you idling your car, or the bus company idling its engines. And it's very important that everybody do what they can. But for the most part, institutional emitters have been off the hook, right? And the largest, as I said, the largest institutional emitter is the Pentagon, right? So they have reduced some of their emissions through efficiencies, but it's really this large, sprawling network of bases, both in the United States and overseas, and the felt desire to get to these places, which is it's the thing we don't talk about. Now, how would we focus on this? Well, first of all, just to recognize that the electric company wanted you to change your light bulb rather than them change their fuel, right? They want you to, use more efficient cars rather than, invest in public transportation. So what we have to do is think about how our institutions are ripe for reform. And this includes the military as the largest emitter. I think you basically simply have to say that the single largest greenhouse gas emitter in the United States is the US military, period. End of story. That's it. And military spending is very directly correlated with emissions. If you graph, except for the United States, which is an outlier, if you graph emissions for most countries and you graph their military expenditures, you'll see that they're very tightly related, right? Now the U.S. Is unique in certain respects because in a lot of ways, well, let me back up. There are two drivers for any country's military emissions. One is their bases and installations, that is the fixed stuff. And the other part of it is their operations. In the United States, of its military emissions, 70% of the emissions or so are operational. That is war fighting and training for war and exercises with other countries. Okay, so so emissions are tightly correlated with that activity, and that spending is related to that activity. But because U.S. military spending has essentially become unmoored from threats, it's unresponsive. The United States military spending should be going down because the threat is actually diminishing. China is not a large military threat comparatively, compared to the United States. Russia is greatly diminished because of their spendthrift and human wasting war in Ukraine. They're less threatening than they were in the past. They have many fewer soldiers available because they're injured or dead, and they've chewed up their equipment. It's been destroyed or used up. So the two major threats are lower than the United States, which has a greater capacity, and what we do can actually drive those threats up. So what I'm suggesting is is that we have to think of this as it's not an individual problem, it's an institutional problem, and we have to think about all of these systems together. I know it's a lot to ask people to say, look, U.S. military spending drives greenhouse gas emissions. You care about the environment, and then they'll say, well, but there's a threat from China. Well, and then you have to explain, well, the Chinese military spending is much less than the U.S. military spending. When you combine Chinese and Russian military spending, it's still much less than U.S. military spending, and they have fewer forces. And the Chinese, for example, only have 1 or 2 overseas bases. And the United States has 700 overseas bases. I think you can begin with these facts to try to sort of put things in perspective. And that's all I think we can do. I do, however, believe that it's important for us, in addition, not to poo-poo the no idling or the battery-powered individual cars. All of this is necessary. Everything has to change. Everything. But instead of focusing on individuals, I think we should focus on institutions. I'm sorry. Instead of solely focusing on individual behavior, we need to focus on institutions and individual behavior. Hope that's clear.
Thank you, Nita. I see Dick Burkhart has his hand raised. I guess rather than doing the chat, we'll have you raise your hand. Dick, do you want to go ahead with your question?
Yeah, I'm mostly focused on the military, but I keep reading that 80% of the world's energy needs are being met by fossil fuels. And most of that goes far, far, far beyond the military in terms of that 80%. Part of that is the military. But what that's saying is the whole global economy, and especially the economic growth we've had up to now, has been fueled literally by fossil fuels. And so I totally agree that reducing the threats would make it more possible. but many of us think that we have to actually look at the whole global economy and say, well, we can't even try to keep growing it. It's not going to be possible even as fossil fuels become more expensive and the cheap fossil fuels are used up and things like that. How can we prepare for maybe not just reducing threats, but reducing actually the economic activity generally that's behind all this?
Well, the fastest growing energy sector, of course, is in renewables, right? Wind and solar.
Still
and
very tiny globally, though. Yeah.
it's really much more than we think, and the rate of growth is exponential, and that's why the oil companies are worried about so-called stranded assets, oil and money that they can't get, oil they can't sell or use. And I think they're concerned that their clout in the world system will also be diminished as their riches diminish, as their resource is less desirable. So I think we have to promote alternative energies. But, look, we've got key interrelated challenges, right? And it's like every piece is connected to every other piece in a sense, and it can be overwhelming. But that's why I think that if we point out the linkages, that's helpful to people, but then we can't at the same time overwhelm them with, now we've got to change the entire economy and you've got to stop eating meat because it's emitting, and you have to walk to work, and you've got to put up solar panels and get not a Tesla battery, but some other battery in your basement, so that you can be off grid. People have to do what they're capable of doing. And we're actually, I think, moving in the right direction if we each do our bit and we don't judge what other people are doing too harshly. But so I think that the most important piece of this is not to scare people, because what fear does is it causes us to, give money to the police and the military and Homeland Security and shut down the borders and say people who are is trying to escape flooding and fires and loss of opportunity shouldn't come. It just makes this fear of the future that we imagine that it will be so horrible is actually accelerating. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's accelerating this decline. And what we have to do is focus on the positive things that we can do in our communities, with each other, and diminish fear. And that's also important in terms of your campaign to reduce military spending, because the more people are afraid, the more they want to give to these institutions that supposedly are going to protect us. But the other thing that happens, the more people are afraid, is they stop thinking as clearly. It's well known in neuroscience that when you're afraid, you stop taking in positive information. You look for threats. You focus on threats. You are less able to make good decisions, right? So the prefrontal cortex, in other words, is not as engaged, in your amygdala. The fear center is engaged. And what we have to do is we have to be in a society where we're a little calmer, a little less afraid, in order to make sure that we're making better choices and we're treating our neighbors who might be climate migrants, from a fire in California to the fires in Canada, to flooding in Louisiana and Alabama and so on, so that we can treat each other with kindness. But democracy is also in jeopardy when we're afraid, right? We can't listen to the other. We can't believe that they're not out to sort of get us. So I think really at the root of everything I'm saying is sort of a sober, sort of less, it's a less alarmist perspective is actually going to be useful. So when I say that, the Pentagon's telling us that climate change will lead to conflict for, the reasons that I suggested that they're highlighting, migration and fighting over resources, and the diminished capacity of governments to help their people. They're painting a world where we are afraid, right? Well, actually, none of those things are guaranteed to happen. In fact, if you build up capacities of governments locally, they don't necessarily have the outcomes that they're saying are a fait accompli. So I think that's why we have to, or I try to, not you. You don't have to do anything, but that's why I try to sort of say, well, look, you can say that, but it's not necessarily the case that is so, and we need to look for solutions that are more positive than what we've been doing.
Nita, I'd like to ask you a question, if I may. Actually, I have two questions, but we have people on the call here from very highly red states that are just barely getting by in terms of surviving in their own particular areas. So I wondered if you could suggest a way forward for those of us on this call who are really under oppression right now. And then my second question for you is in terms of the United Nations and the COPs. I know you're very involved with the UN, and you've spoken at the COPs yourself and the panels, and I wonder if you can put that into perspective for us as well. Thank you.
Okay, right. Well, I'll just start with the COPS question, the Conference of the Parties and the UN system. There are a number of individuals and organizations, for instance, the Conflict Environment Observatory and university professors and so on, who are trying to get military emissions counted and reported. So, in other words, if military emissions are uncounted and not reported, we don't know if we can make the goals for reducing emissions that will help us have a less chaotic and less hot planet, right? In fact, there's new research that has come out recently in a climate communication, the Climate Communication Journal. Maybe it's Nature Communication. I'm forgetting. That says that we can't meet our goals if their estimates for military emissions are correct, right? That we can't meet our climate change goals. So that's why the people at who are in these organizations, and I have also tried to do this, spoken to individuals and engaged in education about the role of military emissions in climate change. And that's why they've gone to the Conference of the Parties and will continue to do so that we can get this reporting to be required instead of optional or not happening at all. And then the other question you asked is, look, I sit in the UK, right? You're in the belly of the beast there, and it's not looking good. I just came back from the US yesterday because I was at a memorial service for a friend, and I can tell you, I feel your pain. I get it. What's happening is not good. What we have here, though, is in part the result of decades of war, where Congress did not exercise its muscles in terms of oversight of wars, has not declared war, but the U.S. has yet gone to war. So there's this deference to the executive that has become habitual. That's part of the problem. So Congress it was already a diminished muscle, a diminished branch of government, where the courts have also, in many cases, deferred to the national security imperative. They declined to even hear cases about drone strikes in some instances because they said, well, this is national security and we can't weigh in on it. Where individual rights of people who were suspected terrorists or who might be funding terrorists were diminished. And this is a legacy, sort of the diminution of rights and oversight is a legacy of war as much as anything else. And what we have to do is, I think, make these connections and try to increase democracy. Democracy is the thing that is required here. Look, democracy is the antidote to war. It really is. It says, we're going to have a conversation. We're going to talk. We're going to argue with each other. We don't need to put a gun on the table to resolve the disputes. We need to work together. So anything that we do to help democracy work, that is in small communities, in conversation with our neighbors, in civic organizations, religious organizations, making democracy work will help in terms of decreasing this sort of militarized impulse. So I look, I'm not there. I will not be one of the people standing out in front, and waiting to be shot at with a beanbag or a rubber bullet. You're there, and you have all my respect.
Thank you so much, Nita. Gary, I understand. I know you had questions that you wanted to ask, Nita. Would you like to go forward? I don't see any raised hands, and if anyone else does want to
Okay,
ask
I
a
have
question,
some
please
questions
raise
in
your
the
hand.
chat when you want them.
Oh, you have some, Sally?
Well, the main thing I had in mind have largely been dealt with. I was concerned with the Kyoto and the COP protocols, and to me, I didn't see much prospect of this moving beyond performative window dressing without substantially getting into the actual numbers. And it sounds like, Dr. Crawford, you're saying there's a desire there, but the muscle, it's hard to use a lot of muscle against the greatest militaries. Do you really see a chance for that happening? That the militaries actually start declaring the real numbers?
Well, the United States produced numbers in the 2021, the FY 2021 National Defense Authorization Act. There was a requirement that the military report, and they did. They reported 10 years of emissions at installations and operational emissions for the period of, I think it was 2009 to 2019. So we have some of that data. I have data in my book that goes back to 1975. And we can see that emissions are correlated with war. When the United States is fighting, emissions go up. As it stops fighting and bases close and there's conversion of those bases, emissions go down. That's the case for all militaries. When you're fighting, your emissions go up. But where there is hope is in both estimating a country's emissions, which this article in Nature Communication does using military spending, and also in getting countries to report their emissions. So Stuart Parkinson and Scientists for Global Responsibility in the UK have done estimates of European emissions. There's some work that I'm participating in on trying to get an estimate of Chinese military emissions, but still the largest single emitter is the United States military.
If I could,
we have to work on that.
That leads to my other question, Dr. Crawford. Base closures, as you pointed out, during the war, during peak wars, we had a couple thousand bases overseas. We still have 700 or 800, depending who's counting. A lot of that is clustered on the Persian Gulf, the Middle East, and you've made a point that we've our fossil fuel capacity internal, our domestic supplies are pretty secure, that there's a rational basis for close many of those bases in the Middle East or West Asia, however one wants to label it. But is the main reason for our presence there inertia, or is it our allies need the security even if it's not for us? Is there other things you see that are
Yeah,
barriers to closing that?
yeah, that's a really interesting question. It's in a way it's complicated, but I'll try to tell you how I've come to see it. Okay, we initially had in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, etc. Those relationships and bases sort of were inherited from the British. When the British left in the late 1960s, the United States literally took over some of those bases, and the U.S. increased its presence there. And this has led, I think, pretty clearly to some countries increasing their own militaries, right? Taking U.S. equipment that's surplus or buying new U.S. military equipment. There's also the persistent conflicts between Saudi Arabia, Iran and Iraq that have also driven the militarization of those areas. And the United States has said that it needs to be there in part to make sure that there's a free flow of oil from that region in case that there's of a conflict. And we've also supported the authoritarian regimes there, the Saudi government, initially the Iraqi government, the Iranian government. We have supported in the past those governments so that the United States could have access to that fuel. And so there's a legacy there, and these are legacy bases, right? So we, in some ways, failed to rethink as we've reduced our dependence on oil. Actually, a global dependence on oil has declined, especially in Europe and North America. We haven't reduced those legacy forces as much as they could be reduced. And this is an area ripe for reanalysis, base closure. And what happened during, in part, the Obama administration and then continued in the Biden administration and accelerating in some ways under Trump is this pivot or swivel or swerving to Asia and the Pacific and the Indo-Pacific Command and the sort of heightened militarization of the relationship with China. So again, the Chinese military is not a massive threat, but they can become so. They're rapidly increasing the number of nuclear weapons that they have. They're going from several hundred to, I think they'll go to 1,200 or 1,500 nuclear weapons. Now, that's significant, but why are they doing that? Because we have a persistent conflict that doesn't actually have to be there. When Biden says that the Chinese are stealing our chips, we shouldn't go to war over intellectual property. They're taking, some people argue, well, they're taking films and they have poor human rights. Well, that's true. There is theft of intellectual property. There is a lack of democracy. Yeah, but we can't solve that through conflict. We can't and escalating the conflict. So yes, partly there's these legacy bases, and we haven't rethought those places, and then partly we are moving some of that equipment, but it's going to Asia or the Indo-Pacific Command, and we need to think about that. And I think at the root of that, both the Indo-Pacific region and the Middle East is trying to resolve the conflicts that are ongoing. Now, none of us, or many of us, can't do that work. Some of you can and are doing the work to help resolve those conflicts. But part of it, the way to resolve those conflicts is to think about alternative defense arrangements. So, in other words, the current way that the United States is planning to fight in Europe and has planned to fight in Europe against Russia, and before that, the Soviet Union, was a sort of set of forces that were capable of deep strikes and deep interdiction and required a lot of military presence, many military bases, lots of exercises to train with allies. They're reproducing the same situation in the Indo-Pacific, planning to deter China by threatening overwhelming deep strike response. Okay, is there another way to protect Taiwan from China? Yes, alternative defense. And it's a technical discussion. We could maybe have a whole nother discussion of just this, but is there another way to defend Europe? Yes, with less aggressive seeming military forces, you can still defend what you want to defend. So we have to decrease the conflicts that are ongoing, the political part of that, and better the human relationships between people. That is moving toward resolving the conflicts, and then we have to think of alternative ways to defend the things that need to be defended with less aggressive military forces, but forces that can still do the job, protect what you want to protect. And so it has to all go together. But at the root of your question, I think, is this notion that we haven't really rethought things. That's true. There's a lot of legacy mentality. We have 13 aircraft carriers. Do we need 13 aircraft carriers? Things like that. We just rethink it from the ground up.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Jim Ryan, would you go ahead and ask your question? But ladies and gentlemen, Jim Ryan is an active member of Veterans for Peace, Climate and Crisis Militarism Project. And Jim, before you leave the call, I hope you will discuss with us what VFP is doing in terms of the No Moss campaign. Thank you.
Thank you,
Stuart.
Cindy.
Yeah.
And thank you, Nita. I appreciated your talk. First, my question, then I'll briefly mention the NOMAS. First, one thing, Nita, I wanted to point out, as you know, that the report that the military gave to Congress is not really accessible online. It's only been done once. And the other thing, the question that I wanted to ask is, how do we break this circle of Congress gives the money to the military gives half the money to contractors, and then the contractors give, I think, since 2003, $100 to $150 million in lobbying. But I'll put in the chat or a link to our Wake Up to the Climate Crisis and No Moss tour, which we're going to be doing in California this fall, and I'll leave it there. Again, thank you, Nita.
Okay. Well, good to see you, Jim. And I put all what the Pentagon said in the book, The Pentagon Climate Change and War. I just reproduced their tables so you can have access to that. Even though it's not online anymore, you can find that in my book. And then in terms of this sort of iron triangle analysis, that's what we used to call it in the 80s, where there's a tight link between the military contractors and military industry, members of Congress, and the funding and so on. That's why Citizens United was important, right? We need to have alternative ways to pay for congressional races. Big money, big donors have too much say. Money is not speech. We've made it so. So I think, again, that's why democracy is so important. It's part of this, it's part of what has to be bolstered, I think, for us to see real change. So I think I've answered your questions. I hope. And then I
Nita,
see a
we've got
chat.
two-
I see something in the chat that I'd like to address, if I might.
Sure.
So could the U.S. negotiate with China to provide for the need for rare earth minerals, mostly mined in China, or will this drive future wars? So on the rare earth metals, they're called rare earth, but they're not so rare. And there's actually a lot of these minerals. Many are found in China. This is true, but they're also available globally. And they found new ways, for instance, of getting lithium from seawater. There's just a lot of work on this, and we can recycle some of these rare earths. We don't have to fight over them. We can buy them. We don't have to fight over oil. We could have bought it, and we still do. We don't have to. We can have a military solution. So it is possible to negotiate, but I don't think it's actually necessary. I think to be afraid. It's not necessary to be afraid of what if China sort of hoards, the rare earth metals. Well, there are many other sources. It's not as if there's only one place to get it. And I think, again, that's a way that we're told we ought to be afraid, when actually we don't have to be so afraid. We can get these rare earths many different ways.
Nita, I don't know how much time you have, but we do have one hand raised and another question in the chat. Do you have time to stay with us just a bit?
Yeah,
or no?
just a few more minutes.
Okay.
My son has to get on the computer, and once he gets on the computer,
I understand.
all power leaves the house. It all goes towards his gaming. So we'll know when he gets on. You won't actually see me anymore. I'll have to turn off my screen.
Okay. Omar Clay is a PhD physicist who's spent a lot of time working on climate. Omar, would you like to ask your question or comment?
Yeah. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. First of all, Nita, thanks for your presentation, and thanks for putting this on as a group. Jim kind of set up my question a little bit, getting back to the military congressional industrial complex, and I wonder if there's a way that we can kind of try to drive some divisions in that complex, and in particular, I mean, I think the IMF estimates that something like 7% of the global GDP has been subsidies for fossil fuel industry. We have,
I think, Omar, you frozen.
even in the United States, for all of our lack of, is going to happen one way or another as we move from fossil fuel to renewable, if for no other reason than fossil fuels are limited and finite in supply. And also to kind of touch on this issue of red states and how you might make an argument about the military. I'm just, what I want to suggest is that that we can try to reconceptualize the way Americans live in fear. We love our military, and rather than just directly addressing military spending as the problem, I wonder how we can maybe look at military spending on fossil fuels as the problem. And in particular, for instance, we think of our military as protecting our national security, but climate change is a major threat. It's a global threat, but it's also a national security threat. And it's a threat to, for instance, our land, sea level rise alone, our agricultural productivity. These things are really, if we had a foreign adversary that was going to steal over 1,000 kilometers of our coastal land area by 2050, that would be a major problem. But all of a sudden, so the Americans are not really conceptualizing climate change as an enemy or as a threat. And I think that if we could try to drive a division between the military and the petrochemical industry, that would be one more way of trying to address the challenges that we're facing. And I guess, in that sense, just from and this is kind of simplistic thinking, but again, I'm thinking about people in the red states, from a warfighter's perspective, a tank or a military vehicle that doesn't have a heat signature because it's electric, that doesn't make a ton of noise because it's electric, is a better warfighting machine. and a military that actually address our real national security threats, which are not from Russia or from China, but are in fact from the way we are destroying the planetary infrastructure. So I just wanted to put those ideas out there and get any feedback you might have, Neta, or anyone else.
Right. So, I didn't speak about, I hope I didn't. I'm trying to change how I talk about it. I don't speak about climate change as a threat. I think it's a challenge. And I wanna encourage us, or at least, I try to do this myself, to demilitarize, to emphasize the link between climate change and security. I think your image of somebody was going to take 1,000 square miles of coastline, we'd be, ready with our pitchforks to defend it, is brilliant. I love it. Or we'd send the military. But what I think is important here is to decouple the climate change and national security narrative, because what that does is it drives military spending up. It drives fear up, which increases military spending and militarization. What we have to do is we've got to look at climate change as a challenge, as a problem that does not engage us so much in our nervous system. And on the other hand, I've got 2 kids and I worry for their futures, but I think it doesn't help if they're scared or I'm scared for them. I think what helps is us saying, here's the challenge and here are some ways that we don't have to keep doing business as usual. In fact, business as usual is what got us here. And we need to think differently about economies, about food production, about dependence on resources that are not needed anymore, and in fact, some of them are toxic and left us with large parts of the country, for instance, Navajo land, or parts of Washington State, which are not inhabitable. People shouldn't be living there. I think that's the only pushback I'd have on you. I think your analysis is right on, but I'm just thinking less in terms of the threat language and more in terms of challenges and opportunities and alternatives, solutions that are real alternatives that actually address these problems rather than inadvertently, unintentionally sometimes, making them worse.
I'd like to make a comment about the Ukrainian operation that took out a whole lot of Russian jets, fighter jets. I think our paradigm of war may be changing, and we have to learn how to get along better, because an individual could make a drone and take out a good portion of our local air bases. What do you see a change in what's going on? Is there potential in that kind of warfare?
Well, look, technology is always changing, and then the military will adapt and try to defend against it. So think about Trump's Golden Dome, which is the strategic defense initiative of Ronald Reagan, something that's meant to protect people. And why is this Golden Dome attractive? Well, because people are afraid of nuclear war and missiles coming from outside. But so let's say the United States goes ahead and builds this missile defense system, the Golden Dome, but it can be defeated by just more nuclear weapons or more hypersonic weapons. So there is no perfect security from the Golden Dome. It's easily defeated. I think the search for perfect security is it's a chimera. It's fantastical, but it is what drives us, and it drives us because we're anxious. And what we need to do is build up, arms control and negotiation and work to end wars, really end them, not just have armed truce. So, yes, changes in technology, or the promise of more tech being the solution to our security, will always be there. But I think is much more fundamental is the software, not the hardware. It's the how we think about things. It's the way we communicate with our adversaries or potential allies. It's decreasing dependence on resources that or just paying for what it is we use, rather than thinking that we have to have the capacity to go take it. So that's the thinking differently, I think, is the solution, not the hardware.
Nita, we've got a bunch more questions coming in on the chat. I don't know how many you have time for, but shall we just keep going until you get cut off?
Yeah, I'd say I can do probably 10 more minutes, and then
okay. Stephen
he'll
Lapham.
come up and say, "Let me on."
Okay, yeah, Stephen Lapham, you have a question?
No, I'll give the floor to other people. She's already chosen one of my questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Robin Dalton. Robin, are you here?
The question was about the climate change, the climate footprint of the military parade.
Yeah, I don't know what that is.
Yeah,
we could calculate that.
Disturbing, but yeah.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, and there's all these overflights over, baseball games and football games and so on. I mean, this sort of demonstration of military might. It's, they have a carbon footprint.
Mm-hmm.
They do. It's unnecessary, right? And it's also slightly dangerous, but we don't have to dwell on that.
Right.
Before we move to the next question, go ahead, Sally.
Yeah, another question that's come up a couple of times is the suggestion of nuclear power as a quote unquote solution to climate change, which of course it's not. How do we address that? And
that's complicated, right? So the reason why the United States aircraft carriers don't have emissions profile is they're all nuclear powered, right? And so are all the U.S. submarines, the attack submarines, and the ballistic missile submarines are all nuclear powered. And so they, of course, it takes greenhouse gas to make that stuff, right? To make the submarines, and it's every surface ship that surrounds a nuclear powered aircraft carrier is fueled by fossil fuel. Right. So, you could have small nuclear power plants doing some of the things that the military does and has already, in fact, transitioned away from using fossil fuels to do. Yes, that's true. Right. And sometimes at different points, the military said we really have to spend a lot more on getting these very small nuclear reactors functioning so that they can be capable of being quickly put up somewhere and used to power a base in a war situation. So it would be less dependent on fossil fuels. So they have scenarios where these small nuclear power plants that they want to invest a lot more research and development in will be useful. Yes. Look, as far as nuclear power being the solution to climate change, I think that it might be the case that the nuclear power plants that are safe and running right now should be kept online, let's say in some countries where they perform a significant part of the electrical generating capacity. Is it a solution now for the kind of quick transition that we need? No, it isn't, because we have the capacity with solar, with wind, and to have a distributed, more democratic and safer solution for these energy needs. right? We don't, it takes so long to permit and construct, and the greenhouse gas emissions required to construct a nuclear power plant are not insignificant in themselves because they require so much concrete that maybe the ones that we already have are sunk costs, and that's fine. They're not without risk, but we really have the solution in hand. We need to invest in it. We have the solutions. Right. We've had these solutions for decades. And the cost of solar power has dramatically declined. What I paid to put solar on the roof of my house in Massachusetts would not be what I pay, prior to Trump's tariffs, but would not be what I paid, let's say, a year ago, if I put them up. I mean, it's dramatically declined, and these solutions are available now. I don't think that investing in nuclear power is going to be the answer that we need right now, right? We have to make a much quicker transition than can be provided for by nuclear power. So I hope that's clear. I know it's a mixed picture, though.
Thank you, Nita. David Delk and Gary Butterfield. David, could you very quickly make the pitch that you mentioned on your chat about the upcoming webinar on nuclear energy and weapons? And also, Gary, could you please very quickly respond to what Nita was bringing up about air shows? David. I don't know. David isn't responding. He's maybe not hearing.
Okay, here I am. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah. So for our August webinar, we're going to focus on the question about nuclear power. Is it a substitute is it a solution to the climate crisis? And we'll also be looking. So we'll have two people from Oregon who have been involved with anti-nuclear work for decades, Lloyd Marbett and Kathy Chuddy. They're both with the Oregon Conservancy Foundation. And then I will be talking about nuclear weapons modernization program and what that means. So I think we'll be able to address some of these questions that might be coming up here. But overall, the answer is nuclear a solution to the climate crisis? The answer is no, it is not.
Thank you, David. David is a member of the UUJEC board. And Gary Butterfield, are you still on the call?
Sure.
Would you like to respond very quickly? Anita brought up the issue of air shows, and that has been a huge focus of Gary Butterfield and VFP. Do you want to talk about that, Gary? Just real
right.
quickly.
We're a group called the Climate Crisis and Militarism Project of Veterans for Peace. And we have found that an effective way to engage climate activists in the discussion about the military's contribution to the climate crisis and to talk about that broader impact is to focus on air shows. There are about 63 national military air shows in the US this year. And it's a focus that allows the climate activists to see, hear, smell, taste the emissions. We know that the actual air show is a small percentage, but we can get the climate activists to look at this as a symptom of the problem, of the bigger problem of the military's lack of transparency in reporting emissions and greenhouse gases and the money they spend. So we have a very robust protest going on. They protested the Annapolis graduation last month. We're looking to do, as Jim said, a bus tour to support with university talks. There's a new film coming out called Earth's Greatest Enemy that focuses on the environmental destruction and climate contribution of the military. So if you're interested, contact Cindy. We've given a Zoom presentation to about 140 different groups, including a lot of local UU jurisdictions that have social justice committees. And we feel that educating the public to this is a key first step in getting more civic involvement and discussion about it.
Thank you, Gary. Has anyone else got a question that I'm overlooking? Sally, is there anything else on the chat that I've missed? It seems like maybe Karen asked a question.
Well, I think we pretty much have everything. One message.
Okay, everybody, this is last chance. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Okay, I don't see anything. Neta, we cannot thank you enough. You're so busy and you're covering so many bases. Just really, really appreciate your being here. All of us do. So, do you have any last words that you would like to share with us, Neta?
Well, first of all, thank you for all the work that you do. I know some of you, for a couple of years now, and you've been doing remarkable work. I really appreciate it. And, we're in a long struggle, right? And I appreciate the effort. It's a marathon, and I'm passed part of my baton on to my daughter, and it's a generational struggle. So I really appreciate your efforts, and thanks for the opportunity to have a conversation with you. And I like, especially Gary, how you ended us up on techniques for organizing, and I think that's where we need to be, finding those hooks and ways to engage people. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Neta.
Okay, I'm going to put up the closing screen.
Thank you all for coming. It means so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay.
A few of us have stayed on. Does anybody want to? Can we chat a little bit just amongst ourselves, Terry, or no? Terry's our tech guy.
That's fine. I'm going to end the